October 14th, 1943. Rojava, Syria. The world was locked in chaos, consumed by an unyielding war that devoured everything in its path. Rojava, nestled in the northern reaches of Syria, had long been a quiet region of unassuming villages and peaceful towns, but now it was a battleground. The ground trembled beneath the march of soldiers, and the air tasted of smoke and dust. Yet, in the midst of this destruction, a woman named Amina moved through the shadows, unnoticed by the very forces that had turned her homeland into a war zone. Amina was a midwife, a profession defined by care, patience, and the intimate relationship between life and death. But for Amina, the role of a midwife had expanded. It was no longer just about ushering life into the world, but about protecting the lives of those who fought for freedom. Amina's village had seen its fair share of tragedy, but the pain she witnessed now was different. The invaders were no longer distant shadows. They were here, occupying her land, threatening her people, and demanding their loyalty. The men who once fought proudly for their homes and families were now scattered, hiding in caves or crossing dangerous borders. They had no voice, no power, and worse, no way to resist the might of the occupation. But Amina saw the cracks in the system. She saw the vulnerability in the way the enemy operated. They assumed that the village was full of women, children, and old men, too weak, too unthreatening to be dangerous. They underestimated the resilience of her people, and that, perhaps, was their greatest mistake. Every night, Amina would close her home's doors against the encroaching violence outside. But within those walls, she hid more than the fragile lives of her children or her aging mother. Her small, dimly lit home became a sanctuary for resistance fighters who had nowhere else to go. They arrived at night, their faces hidden beneath scarves, their footsteps muffled by the heavy air of secrecy. They would come with a quiet knock, and Amina, always prepared, would open the door, their tired eyes meeting hers as though she were the last thread of hope in their war-torn world. For Amina, each night felt like walking a razor's edge. She would prepare for each birth with a precision that mirrored the strategy of an army general. Every movement was deliberate. The infants she helped bring into the world had no idea of the world they were born into. The cries of the newborns were louder than the sounds of artillery in the distance. And for those moments, Amina's home became a sanctuary of life, an island of warmth in a sea of cold violence. But Amina wasn't just protecting the innocents. She was also protecting the souls of the fighters who sought refuge under the cover of darkness. Their very existence was a risk. Each moment they spent inside her home was a gamble with their lives, with her own life, and with the lives of the innocent women and children who depended on her. One particular night, Amina heard the sharp rattle of gunfire in the distance. Her heart quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. The fighters had been gone for hours, sneaking off into the night after a quick exchange of supplies, but the danger had always been imminent. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, her hands trembling as she continued to tend to her most recent delivery, a boy, his small body already crying against the cruel world that would try to destroy him. The cries of the newborn mingled with the sounds of the war outside, and for a moment, Amina allowed herself to imagine a world where there was no war, no occupation, no resistance, just peace. She gently rocked the baby in her arms, smoothing back his damp hair. What would he grow up to be? Would he know what it was like to live in a time when hope was an illusion, a fleeting fantasy in the face of brutal reality? But the world she lived in was not so kind. The cries of the baby were interrupted by the sound of pounding at the door. Amina's heart skipped a beat. She quickly set the baby down on the clean linen she had prepared for him, motioning to the other women in the room to stay quiet. The sound of a knocking was urgent, and as the door rattled, Amina's hand went instinctively to the knife she kept hidden under the edge of the table. She had to make sure that the soldiers didn't find them. No one could know. She moved quietly to the door, her breath held, her heart in her throat. Slowly, she opened it a crack, peering into the darkness beyond. The figure standing in the doorway was not one she recognized. He was cloaked in shadow, his face partially obscured by a scarf. But there was something in his posture, something in the way he stood that told her he was not a soldier. He was a fighter, a rebel. "There's no time," the man whispered urgently, his voice low and strained. "They're coming. We need to move." Amina's pulse quickened. She stepped aside, allowing him to slip into the house. Her gaze flicked to the other women in the room, a silent exchange passing between them. They all knew what was at stake. The man's arrival meant danger, but also meant survival. "Get the children," Amina instructed quietly. "The others will hide in the cellar." The baby, still crying softly, lay on the linen as the other women gathered the small children from the back room. Amina's hands shook, but she didn't let it show. She had to keep them calm, keep them focused. This wasn't her first time in danger, and it wouldn't be her last. The men she hid in her house had often brought news of their missions, of what the occupation had done to her people, of the destruction they had caused. But it was not their eyes that Amina feared. It was the eyes of the soldiers, the ones who would never hesitate to destroy everything in their path to maintain control. The rebel moved toward the back of the house, his movements tense. Amina watched him closely, her mind calculating, planning, figuring out her next move. She couldn't allow them to search her house. If they did, if they found the fighters hidden below, there would be no escaping the punishment. Amina's family would be marked, her home burned to the ground. There was no room for mistakes. The door rattled again, this time harder, more insistent. Amina held her breath, standing in the narrow hallway. Her fingers tightened around the knife in her hand, ready for whatever came next. She prayed the soldiers wouldn't force their way inside. She prayed they wouldn't notice the faint traces of mud on the rebels' boots or the quiet thuds of footsteps in the hallway. Amina's heart pounded in her chest as the door shook again. And then, as if by some miracle, the soldiers' voices faded into the night. The pounding stopped. Amina let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But the danger was far from over. The rebels were still in her house. The soldiers were still out there. Amina knew that time was running out. The war wasn't just fought with guns. It was fought with silence, secrecy, and stealth. With the rebels hidden below, Amina returned to the newborn, lifting him into her arms once more. She held him close, the tiny body warm against her chest. His cries filled the room, but Amina wasn't afraid of the sound. It was a sound of life, a sound of resistance. Each birth she assisted, each child she helped bring into the world, was a victory, no matter how small. And with each child, she grew more determined to protect them all. She may have been a midwife, but in the midst of a war that took everything from her people, she was also something else. She was a protector, a guardian, a fighter. February 21st, 1944. The mountains of Kandil, Iraq. The fire in Amina's heart had not been extinguished, nor had it dulled with the passage of time. But now, it burned with an even greater intensity. The months that had followed her first involvement with the resistance had transformed her. What once began as a simple act of defiance, hiding a handful of fighters under the cover of night, had grown into a well-organized network. The men who sought shelter in her home no longer hid out of desperation, but out of conviction. Their cause had become her cause. They had been warriors for a time, but now they were defenders of a way of life, a life she was fighting to preserve as much as they were. When the war had come to Rojava, Amina had been forced to watch helplessly as the enemy closed in, steadily erasing the landscape of her youth. But in the months that followed, she realized the full scope of the brutality she was up against. It wasn't just the occupation forces that threatened her home and her people. It was the systems that allowed such forces to operate with impunity, the governments and empires that turned a blind eye to the suffering of civilians, to the slaughter of the innocent. It was then that Amina knew she couldn't just be a midwife. She couldn't be a mere bystander in a world that was suffocating. Her hands could do more than deliver life. They could safeguard it. So, with each passing day, she became something more than what her neighbors saw. In the mountains of Kandil, in the narrow, dusty paths between the scattered villages, Amina's name began to be whispered among the fighters. She was the one who never hesitated, who never faltered. She was the one who knew how to hide people when the enemy came knocking. She was the one who took risks without second thoughts. And to them, she was a symbol of unwavering courage. But courage had its price. The day began as most others did. A faint drizzle falling over the mountainside, making the stones slick and treacherous underfoot. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and the promise of something far more dangerous lurking in the wind. Amina walked to her small outpost in the hills, a tiny house perched on the edge of a cliff that overlooked the valley. It was here that she had set up a small medical station for the fighters. It was here that they brought their wounded, the ones who were too precious to lose, the ones who still had the strength to fight another day. But on this particular morning, it wasn't a wounded fighter that arrived first. It was a message slipped through the crevice of her door, delivered by a runner who barely spoke. The note was simple, cryptic even. The time has come. They will be looking for you. Amina's hand trembled slightly as she read the words. She didn't need further explanation. The soldiers had been closing in for weeks, sending scouts into the region, searching for any sign of rebellion, any hint of defiance. The clock was ticking, and soon it would run out. Within the hour, several more fighters arrived at her home. They were led by a man named Yusuf, whose face was lined with the kind of sorrow that war etched onto the hearts of all who fought it. Yusuf was the leader of the cell that had operated in the region for the past few months, coordinating the movement of fighters from one safe house to another, organizing ambushes, and doing everything in his power to slow down the inevitable. But even Yusuf, the ever-optimistic leader, could see that they were running out of time. "Do you know how many of them are out there?" Amina asked, her voice steady despite the apprehension that crawled up her spine. "Too many," Yusuf replied, his gaze unwavering. "We've been moving too much, too fast. They know we're here. We're in danger, but so are they. The question is, which of us will break first?" Amina's mind raced. There was no time to waste. She quickly set to work, gathering medical supplies and checking the small stash of weapons she kept hidden beneath the floorboards. Her hands moved with practiced ease, each motion deliberate, yet there was a tension in the air, a kind of urgency that she hadn't felt before. The fighters, once calm and collected, were now anxious, their faces drawn and weary. It wasn't just the soldiers they feared. It was the slow erosion of hope that threatened to consume them all. "They'll be here before nightfall," Yusuf said, his voice grim. "We need to move, or we'll be caught in the open." Amina nodded. She didn't need to be told twice. She knew that if they stayed too long, the soldiers would overrun the area, closing in from every direction. The valley would be crawling with them. The last thing they needed was to be trapped with nowhere to go. "Get the others," she instructed. "We'll move to the safe house in the lower valley. It's hidden, but we'll need to leave as soon as we can." Yusuf's eyes flickered with a mix of gratitude and fear. He turned to gather the remaining fighters, but Amina lingered for a moment, looking out at the valley below. The mountains seemed to stretch on forever, their jagged peaks piercing the sky like ancient sentinels. But to Amina, the mountains felt like a prison. No matter how high they climbed, no matter how far they ran, they were always being hunted, always being chased by an enemy that seemed to be one step ahead. As the fighters prepared to leave, Amina took a moment to herself. She walked to the small window of the house and peered out, watching the mist swirl around the mountain pass. She had never felt the weight of her decisions more than she did now. Every step she took had consequences, not just for herself, but for the people she had sworn to protect. The rebels weren't just fighting for a cause. They were fighting for survival. And the price of survival was steep. She thought of the children she had delivered, the mothers she had comforted in their final moments. What would they think of the woman who had become both protector and warrior? Would they ever understand the sacrifices she had made, the darkness she had walked through to shield them from the light of the world outside? By mid-afternoon, the group was ready to move. They gathered their belongings in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Amina, always the calm center of the storm, gave final instructions to the fighters. Her hands were steady, but her mind was racing, calculating the safest route, identifying the points where they would need to hide or defend themselves. Every minute mattered. They couldn't afford to be seen. They set off through the mountain passes, their footsteps muffled by the soft fall of snow. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, as though the mountains themselves were waiting for the inevitable clash between the rebels and their oppressors. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, Amina couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the soldiers, with their superior numbers and resources, had already surrounded them. It was a sense she had learned to trust, a sixth sense that had kept her alive all this time. By the time they reached the safe house in the lower valley, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. The house was a simple structure, stone walls and a thatched roof, almost indistinguishable from the many others scattered throughout the valley. But it was well hidden, tucked away in a grove of trees that provided natural cover. Amina breathed a sigh of relief when she saw it. For now, they were safe. But only for now. The fighters immediately set to work reinforcing the area, setting up barricades, and ensuring that the windows were covered. Amina, though, moved with purpose to the small back room where she kept her medical supplies. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The soldiers would come, they always did. And when they came, there would be no room for mistakes. As night fell and the wind howled through the trees, Amina found herself alone for a brief moment. She sat by the dim fire, her mind still spinning. She thought of the faces of the young rebels she had saved, the mothers she had held as they brought new life into the world, and the endless nights she had spent in fear, waiting for the soldiers to arrive. She had sacrificed so much already, but how much more would she have to give before it was all over? In the distance, she thought she heard the faintest sound, footsteps barely audible over the wind. She stood up, her heart racing. The soldiers were close. They were coming for them, and there would be no turning back. July 9th, 1945. Aleppo, Syria. The war had ended, but Amina had not yet fully realized it. The soldiers had left, the gunfire had ceased, and the world had started to pick up the pieces. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, Amina felt as though the war was still alive in her bones, still echoing through the valleys and the mountains that she had once crossed with such fear, such urgency. Victory, she had learned, was a double-edged sword. There was no celebration in her heart, no sense of triumph. Instead, there was a hollow space, a feeling that the world she had fought to protect no longer existed. What had it all been for, if not for this very moment, when everything was supposed to be better? Her house in Aleppo was modest, unassuming. The bricks that once had been warm now seemed cold, oppressive, like the walls were closing in around her. The world outside had moved on, the streets bustling with a new air of freedom. But for Amina, the world felt different now. It felt like she was carrying a weight that no one else could see. The battles that had once raged in her soul now felt like ghosts, ghosts of those who had fought beside her and those who had died, forgotten, along the way.